Hey, everybody, thanks for carving some time out. This idea came about because I learned from Len Volk and some others that several of our CSAs are required to earn the Azure Security Engineer Associate credential, and maybe you're in that population. And I've taught this material, I don't know how many times, and figured, well, I'm happy to give a boot camp. Let's see what's going on. So I understand we're going to meet weekly for an hour each week. And my proposed learning plan, I included some open spot in here. Of course, we want to cover each of the four content areas on the exam. Manage identity and access, what we'll do today, implement platform protection, manage security operations, and secure data and applications. But then there's two additional sessions, so I'm definitely open for your feedback. If there is anything in particular to extend upon this, I'm happy to go there. You just let me know in the chat or verbally or offline. My alias is Tim Warner here at Microsoft. So I actually wanted to start just by asking you all what you had for me in terms of questions, concerns about the Azure Security Engineer certification. Once I've addressed any initial questions, I figured we could jump right into some practice exam items at MeasureUp and take a look at mapping the way that Microsoft is going to evaluate your skills with Azure Security and putting that together with exam strategy. All right. I liked this study model. I developed this a long time ago, although only recently started using the Tower Bridge in London as the metaphor. But I submit that success on any IT certification exam is going to involve a healthy balance among these three elements you see on the slide. We've got our two pillars, conceptual understanding. There, I think the MS docs are certainly going to be at the top of the list for Azure and the Azure security sites. The AZ500 is a hands-on exam in as much as it's expected that the Azure security engineer knows how to actually implement and configure the security controls as opposed to knowing what they are and what their value prop is. I doubt very seriously you'd see a lab item on the exam. The way it works, this is just my understanding anecdotally, is that the lab exams where you would go into the portal and you'd have to complete a bunch of tasks. In fact, I think when I took AZ500, there was the labs in there. Those got stripped out because I guess the sandbox, the MS Learn Azure subscription sandbox environment got breached. And you know what people were doing in there, right? They were mining Bitcoin. So that the lab environment got shut down for at least a couple years. I have heard that recently, as of the last few months, we've been gradually rolling some of the lab stuff back in. But from what I understand from Liberty Munson, it's just in selected exams. I guess they're being pretty tight-lipped about it. And I think it's only when you go to a Pearson VUE testing center that you would even be likely to see any of those lab items. Hopefully you take exams remotely like I do. I absolutely love remote testing. I guess that's one thing from the pandemic that is a positive, at least it has been for me. Anyway, notice that the bridge that aligns these two posts or polls is practice exam review, and that's where MeasureUp comes in. And it's cool that we've got free access to MeasureUp as Microsoft employees. To that point, I didn't have privilege to put this slide deck in the Teams chat channel, but Claudia, I forwarded it to you and Mike earlier today. If you haven't already, if you'd please pop the slide deck into the our chat channel team or our Teams chat files list. There we go. Yeah. So y'all can get a hold of this slide deck ASAP. But what I've got here is just some simple AKA short links. A short link that goes to the AZ500 exam page. That, of course, is your source of truth for what the exam, what the content is, and it's also where you go to register for the exam. Another nice benefit we have as Microsoft employees is that we don't have to pay the 165 USD registration each time we take the exam. That's a wonderful benefit. I do have a full 9 or 10-hour video training course from Microsoft Press on this exam. That's why I figured it'd be good for us to go into MeasureUp because at least as of now, we have access to the O'Reilly Learning Catalog and my videos are in there. So I cover literally every single objective on the blueprint in that video training course, aka.ms AZ500 Tim. So in order to maximize our efficiency and time, I wanted to point you there. As far as hands-on, you probably have, whether it's through Visual Studio Online or whatever, you've got some access to Azure. If not, I definitely recommend the hands-on labs that are in MS Learn. Here's a short link, aka.ms az500 MS Learn, that will take you to the Azure Security Engineer track in MS Learn. And what's nice about those exercises is that not only are they curated step-by-step labs, but a lot of them include sandbox access into Microsoft's internal subscriptions. Either the lab might have you go in the portal or the Cloud Shell or some combination thereof. Lastly, a short link to get to the internal MeasureUp subscription is aka.ms/measureup. And it looks like we don't have access to every practice exam in MeasureUp's library, but certainly all of the major ones, and AZ500 is certainly on that list. So that said, anybody want to volunteer any questions? What is on your mind about AZ500, about the exam content, about item types, about best high impact study resources? Please, anybody got a question?
I do understand that we are going to lose access to the O'Reilly doc
Hmm.
videos soon.
Yeah.
Do we have any options outside of that
Oh
for?
boy. Yeah, I heard that. I was hoping it was a bad rumor, but it appears to be true. Do you or does anybody know when that O'Reilly subscription is going to end? Darn.
Honestly, I can't remember. I saw it in an email, and then kind of gets drowned out with the rest of them. So,
Indeed, I understand. Let's see, alternatives to O'Reilly. Well, because this my video course is Microsoft Press, it would be available at the MS Press store. Now, what that means for us as employees, I don't know, honestly. One thing I've learned, I've been a full-timer for 6 months now. One thing I've learned above all else is that the answer's out there. It's just a question of finding it, this galaxy of possibilities of trying to find. So I'm sure that there's an answer there in terms of if we get a deep discount or free access to video training in Microsoft Press. I just don't know. Other than that, I know that we have some kind of benefit with my former employer, Pluralsight, and I contributed significantly to the videos that are in the Pluralsight AZ500 track. But I learned not too long ago that they're going to retire all my courses at the end of this year. So again, we had a quarter of the year left, but let's see. So that comes off the top of my head. What other questions do y'all have? What do you want to know? No? Well, I'll tell you what. Let me go to aka.ms, not AKS, aka.ms/az500. And a couple things I want to point out here. Let me turn off my, oh, it is darkener. Why am I seeing dark mode by default? Anyway, this is our base of operations for the exam, if you don't know. And some things that have changed on here recently that I want to call out if it's been a while since you've taken a Microsoft Cert exam is that historically, if you scroll past the exam scheduler, you have the skills measured. And there used to be a button here where you could click to see a detailed objective domain of all of the skills covered on the exam. And what I liked about that is that it told you exactly what changed during the last update. Unfortunately, that seems to not be the case. And I'm currently investigating with MS Learn to try to get some answers because number one, they've changed where you get to the objective domain. It's now kind of hidden. If we scroll up the page and we go to this callout tip, it's now under the AZ500 study guide link here. So let me give that a click. And that does, it clicks out to a Word document that has a lot more in it than just the objective domain, as you can see. But if you come down under skills measured, this shows the actual line items that you can expect to see. But unfortunately, they don't seem to do that deal where it shows you. It used to be you could see revision marks that when there were upcoming changes, you could see exactly what's being added, what's being removed. I have no idea why that's gone the way of the dodo, but I can tell you one thing. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to evangelize bringing that back. Now, some tips and tricks here. Are you going to see everything on this exam on your exam? The lion's share of it, in my experience, yes. I've taken, I think, all of the Azure exams at this point. You'll find that this is a very accurate representation of the content on the actual exam. However, of course, there would need to be 300 questions in order to create a question on every single line item. You'll find that maybe something is mentioned in a case study or something is mentioned in a distractor or an incorrect answer choice. So long story short, you do want to make sure that you've looked at every single line item. And sometimes they're a little bit sneaky here. Like this one here, it says configure Azure role permissions, and then it mentions these various scopes. If I were making a spreadsheet out of this, I might put these scopes on different levels, although this isn't the best example for that. But a tip that I've often given to students is to pop this into Excel and create a study spreadsheet. For instance, the first column might be the top level heading. The second column would be the second level headings. And on the third column, you can put each of these individual granular skills on there. That way you've broken it out, and at least in a way that for me it's easier to parse and mark up and so forth. And you also could maybe challenge yourself. I would recommend that you go ahead and register the exam, because I found, at least in my experience, putting that line in the sand is a nice self challenge, because you've registered the test, so now you do have a due date, as it were, for appearing for the test. And you could maybe use the Excel autofill feature to put in your date down at the bottom and then reverse fill to so you can align different skills to different days. Just ideas that could perhaps be helpful to you. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? Also on that page, the AZ500 page, in the same section actually, underneath the link for the study guide, this is really cool. There's a demo environment called the Exam Sandbox, and this clicks out to an interface that looks exactly like the live exam, where you've got your student agreement here, and then our title page, which shows the number of questions. I don't remember exactly how the AZ500 was set up, but normally the associate exams are approximately 55 questions or so. And you'll have, I would estimate, a couple hours anyway, at least, to get through those items. And the passing score is always 700 on a 1000 scale. But the Microsoft Learn folks are quick to say that that does not necessarily mean 70%, because you're going to see some items that you don't know this, but they're ungraded because they're beta items and that kind of stuff. So anyway, the purpose of this demo sandbox environment is to show you the different item types that you'll see on your exam. And there's some strategy I want to share with you just buzzing through these. Number one, I want you to see that the timer up here is going to be overall, even though the exam isn't a straight line. And what I mean by that, let me bring my drawing tools out, is that you'll find you'll be working along the main trunk of the exam, answering multiple choice questions, certain interactive items. And then if you hit a case study, let's say, you're going to need to drop into that. You can't skip it. You're going to have to do it right then. And that's going to be a separate set of questions. Normally, the case studies have between like 3 and I've seen as many as 14 questions on a single case study. But the case study is not separately timed. So you want to keep an eye on that timer as you're working through. When you submit your answers for the case study, you go back to the main line of the exam. You cannot go back and review the testlet. That's what this is called. It's basically a test inside of the test. This is also how those performance-based lab items work. One other case where you get a testlet where you can't skip it, you got to do it then, and then you can never come back, is a newer item type. I don't think it's in this sandbox environment, unfortunately, but the questions come in groups, and I think it's well logical, I think, why you can't go back and forth among those particular items, because the way they work is they'll give you a problem statement that's the same for all of the items in the set, but it'll be a different solution, and you have to answer, does this solution meet the goal, yes or no? And hopefully it makes sense that Microsoft doesn't want us to use anything other than our skills. They don't want us to use deductive reasoning. Like if we answer yes on the first one, and then on the second one we realize, oh, wait a minute, the previous one should have been no. You can't do that with this particular item type. So there is quite a bit of psychometrics, if you don't mind the €5 term, that goes into the item development here. So then eventually you complete the exam and you go on. This is showing a typical single answer multiple choice item. Regarding the multiple answer, multiple choice items, there's three things I want you to know here. One is that you're not going to see any of that nonsense of choose all that apply. It'll always say which two, which three. And you'll also see that the validation here is such that if you choose too many, you'll get alerted. If you don't choose enough and you go to your next item, you'll get alerted. This is really empowering, I think, because it's helping you minimize human error and making sure if you get points off, it's because you don't know the content as opposed to forgetting to check a box or something. You do get partial credit, so please never ever leave items unanswered. The way I like to describe it is if you submit any of these exam questions blank, unanswered, you have a 100% chance of having 0 points. But if you even guess in a worst case scenario, you have a greater than 0% probability of getting at least 1 point. So never ever submit your any questions unanswered. This is showing select in place. There's two things I want to show here. It's like a matching exercise is these drag bars are useful, especially on an exam like AZ500, because you're likely to have a lot of data analysis to do. This is another reason why measure up is super important, and we will jump over there momentarily, I promise. So you've got your split bars. The other thing is don't think that if you've already used a block, that means you can't use it again. All of that grade school parlor trick stuff about, well, if the teacher has you do AA, you know that the next answer is not going to be A. There's not going to be any of that stuff on these exams. You might find that the same block is used in every slot. You might find that it's used not at all. The point is to apply skills, not to try to do exam tricks, you see. Now, for stepwise procedures, of which there's a fair amount with AZ500, where there's tasks that need to be done in a particular order, here we can use the keyboard. It's tougher to use a keyboard on these exams, I've found. Not impossible, I've done it before. It's a lot easier if you're fortunate enough to have a working keyboard and mouse and a decent sized monitor. But here we're selecting X number of tasks, and it'll tell you how many tasks, and then in which order you perform them. Again, take heart if you feel a little bit intimidated when you first see these. Understand you'll get partial credit and pay very close attention to every word in the question. Which 5 tasks should you do to create a ham sandwich? Every single word in these AZ500 questions is going to be meaningful. And I don't know how many times I've looked at a question, answered, and then fortunately had a second thought. Why don't I go back and read the question one more time? And there was one word that totally changed my answer. You're not going to find any red herrings or fluff or filler content on these exams. They're very terse and every word is meaningful. That's the idea. That's by design. Now, this is an active screen type item. As you can see, there's live controls on this UI. However, nowadays, and for AZ500, the context that you're most likely to see this is with code, actually. So with Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, you might see JSON. Of course, that's data serialization. That's not a programming language, but you might see a JSON deployment script or an Azure policy definition or a custom RBAC role definition, and you'll have interspersed in the code these drop-down controls. And your goal in that item is simply to fill in each of those until the code makes sense. So this is Microsoft's way to verify that you understand what the code is doing and how to do it. You're not going to be writing any code on these exams. Even fun fact, even on the Azure development exam, you're never writing any code. You'll see quite a few analysis type interactive items like this one where you're given data tables and a lot of text to parse through. And then you need to decide, for instance, in this case, create a user role on and just choose from these active controls. Those show up in a number of different ways. Here's the case study, which tends to cause students a lot of concern and fear, but I don't think it needs to. Let me give you a quick recipe here. When you see a case study, go ahead and take a look at the different tabs. But don't try to memorize everything. Just get a feel for it. See what's going on, Just click through and look for keywords and think about if there's a theme going on. Because a lot of times a case study will be skewed toward one or two themes. You'll think, okay, this one's really focused on external identities and conditional access and MFA, or this one is really focused on migration. Just get a feel. And then when you look at each question that corresponds to it, you're going to find that the actual questions are super duper terse. That might just be one or two sentences. You need to solve the problem with app one. Take advantage of those terse items because like I said, sometimes you'll get a gift where it'll even mention the tab that it's referencing. So you shouldn't have to go through every tab. You should be able to find, okay, the clue I'm looking for is going to be over here on app 1. And you'll find instead of a wall of text, how it used to be many years ago, like I remember back in the early Windows Server cert days, like Windows Server 2000 and 2003, these things would be walls of text. They were ridiculous. But now you'll find that the tabs are a lot of times just a punch list or a bullet list of a few statements. And you'll find the statement, and it's normally just a single statement that's going to be the clue that you need to mentally map back to the question, and then you answer the question and you go about your business. Rinse and repeat until you're done with the case, exit the case, and you're good to go. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and then in terms of analysis questions, you'll see this one an awful lot too, where you'll be given content and then there'll be statements down here that you either agree with or don't. And once again, I just want to advise you that there's absolutely no rhyme or reason to this. Like you might see a list of 5 statements, and you might at first run go through and all of them are no, or maybe all of them are yes. I know, thinking of myself as a high school student many years ago, I think, oh, well, surely they wouldn't have it be yes, 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 yes. No, it very well might be. There's none of that algorithm. It's not an issue at all. So again, I just want to stress that. All right, let me stop talking for just a second again. Any questions come up? That's why I'm here. You sure? I mean, that's the benefit of this training, I would think, because, anybody can watch a video. I'm happy to address your questions as they happen. So I'm going to aka.ms/measure up. Here's our measure up for Microsoft employees page, and we're going to filter for AZ500. And we're going to launch it. Now, if you don't know about Measure Up is Microsoft's only official practice test provider. It's what I recommend to students above all others, not just because of that fact and the fact that Measure Up's been around for, well, a couple dozen years now, I think, is because I think partially because of the relationship between Measure Up and Microsoft, Measure Up has pressure on them to keep their exams up to date and aligned as closely as possible with the live exams. So lots of good things going on here. What I recommend, at least initially, is that you do measure ups in practice mode. That way you can reveal the answer and dig in right there instead of postponing it. And what we'll do here in test options, I'm going to turn off randomization. I'm going to go to continue initially, and I'm going to say only show questions from, and I'm going to select the first section of the exam, manage identity and access. And let's see here, down here, I'm going to say auto display answers to any response to make sure that we see the answer and the explanation no matter what. Little bit of a wonky interface here. It's saying that according to the selected options, the number of available questions is 39. So what we actually have to do is step back one, plug that number in here. That's got to be a bug. If I remember, I'll tell Measure Up about that. Let me actually write that down. Bug about selecting objective items, because I don't think that's not good
We had the
experience.
same one for the AZ305 training when we did
No
Measure Up
kidding.
together.
So
Yep,
it's a
it's very
long-standing issue.
annoying.
Yes, it is. Well, I'm definitely on it. I wrote that down. I will follow up with my friends at Measure Up. So let's go to continue here and click start, and let's see what's going on. Let's go next. Next, going through the preliminaries. Begin test. All right, so this is kicking us off. It says case study, but I don't think it is. If I remember correctly, this is one of those deals that I mentioned that the items come in groups, and you can't, on the live exam, you can't go back and forth, because on question 1 it says, does this solution meet the goal? And if we say no, and then we go to question 2, it's the same problem but a different solution. Measure Up doesn't have an exact replica of Microsoft's exam engine, but they try. Given their own development constraints, they try. This one's also pretty verbose. Let me see if I can summarize it. So we've got a subscription for multiple applications in Azure. The subscription's part of a tenant. We're doing synchronization with Azure AD Connect with local Active Directory. The resources for each app are contained in resource groups. As additional users are added, you add roles for those users at the resource group level, okay? You need to efficiently manage permissions assigned to Azure AD users to access these resource groups. All right, that's quite a bit of wind going on. We're looking at least privilege role assignments here for our users. The solution, you create Azure AD groups for each application, add users to those groups, and assign roles to the groups at the resource level. Does this solution meet the goal? Again, this is a little bit more complex actually than what you'll probably find on the live exam, because this one seems to be juggling too many balls, so to speak. The exam items are much more granular, generally speaking. Second solution, you create security groups in local Active Directory, add users to those groups, and assign roles to the groups at the resource group level. I can think you'd agree that that would be a no-go right out of the box. The third option, the third variant, I should say, you remove permissions for the users at the resource group level and apply the same permissions at the subscription level. That seems like an ugly choice. Let me come up to the top and let's see what the answer is. Now, some study tricks I want to explain here with MeasureUp to improve your efficiency. Number one, take advantage of the fact that the MeasureUp items are required. I know because in the past years I've written for MeasureUp. I haven't for a number of years, but I have in the past. That the writers here are required to explain A, why the correct answer is correct, and B, why the incorrect answers are incorrect. So take advantage of these explanations. And also you'll find that the references will always go to a first-party docs page. So take advantage if as you're reviewing these items, not only to understand the explanation, but feel free to click out to MS Docs and take a look for some further elucidation there, all right? So this is too chunky of an item, to be honest. I'm trying to find something a little more streamlined for us here, given time and everything. Let's try this one. You're the global administrator for your Azure AD tenant in your company. All right. Your company wants to assign newly added users to a specific group based on attributes without increasing the workload for the ops teams. You need to assign these users automatically. What should you use? Well, it's kind of a leading question, but what do you think? I think it's all right. Do we want to make use of group owners, dynamic membership rules, groups administrator, self-service group management? Take a sip of my coffee. Now you're going to find that I'm pretty picky. I apologize. I'll do my best to muzzle myself for the following 5 sections. It's hard for me to keep my mouth closed with critiquing this sometimes. But some things that are a little bit different from what you'll see on your real exam is that you won't be led like this. This is a bit on the nose. I mean, because it really tells you not only do you need to assign newly added users based on attributes, but you want to do that without increasing administrative effort. And then in case you don't get the hint, you need to assign these users automatically. It's not going to be that on the nose on the live exam. Number two, the live exam will always have plausible answer choices. You're not going to see a bogus option like, I don't even know if there's a such thing as groups administrator anywhere in Azure Active Directory. Certainly there's a concept of group owners. Certainly there's dynamic membership rules. And I don't know, self-service group management. I mean, I think of products like entitlement management and privileged access groups in Azure AD PIM, but no, that's kind of bogus as well. What you're going to see on the live exam are 4 plausible choices. All right. Now, the answer here definitely is dynamic membership rules, where we can use the that expression language. I don't know if Microsoft has a name for it, based on user attributes. For instance, you know, if anybody has a user attribute for city set to New Orleans, then automatically populate them in the New Orleans Azure Active Directory group. Let's see. You manage an Azure App Service app that hosts website artifacts in a general purpose V2 storage account. You need to configure the app to authenticate programmatically to the storage account. What would you do? Azure RBAC role assignment, Azure AD user, managed identity, Azure AD Connect VM. You know what would be cool that I'll keep in mind for next week is if we used a third-party product that allows polls and voting and that kind of stuff, that would be pretty sweet. So I could get more live feedback and we all could see it. But anyway, this is, again, pretty straightforward. The correct
Yeah, and
answer
I
is,
encourage everyone to put in a chat your answer because
mm-hmm,
it should be interactive. So, like, what you think, A, B, C, and D, the
mm-hmm.
number.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Good one, Claudia. Let's
So,
consider,
so we
although they're
see,
not labeled,
Mhm.
let's consider them A through D. Yeah. Yeah, the different identity types are something that you need to know cold for AZ500 for sure. In fact, I was just noting this morning for some reason. Let me actually jump over to the portal. Although AZ500 is not aimed specifically at developers, it's got a lot more development type stuff in it than many development focused exams, actually. So for example, in Azure AD, of course, we've got our human users and our human groups as an identity class. And there we've got the member and the guest classes using external identities for guests. We have the notion of synchronized identities from on-premises Active Directory. But of course, those are just the human users. Then we have our service principals. We have our app registrations that we've created that support Azure AD authentication. They are considered citizens in the Azure AD identity world. They can obtain an access token on their own behalf or behalf of connecting clients. And then, of course, we have the managed identity ecosystem where we can create our own user assigned managed identities and assign them privileges. And then lastly, we have the system assigned managed identities for many Azure resources, where, for instance, if this virtual machine had code on it that needed to run and needed to say, get something from Key Vault or upload some blobs, we can actually assign RBAC roles to the virtual machine identity itself, with the difference being when we delete the virtual machine, Azure will clean up the system assigned identity automatically, as opposed to user assigned identities or freestanding identities that we create and we choose when to dispose of. Yeah, that's a big subject on the exam for sure. Now, what used to be on the exam a lot is the hybrid identity stuff, but that appears to have been booted out to AZ305. We can verify that really quickly. Let me just jump over to the exam AZ500 page again. And I should have bookmarked it or pinned the tab. We'll go back to the study guide and let me just do a control F for Azure AD Connect. Yeah, it's not even in the outline. Isn't that something? Or let me look for pass through. This is a good tip as you're studying to help you minimize wasted time. Before going too far down the rabbit trail on something, make sure that it actually is going to be on the exam. And like I said, there's been a gradual refactoring. Maybe I didn't say it. But, even as recently as a year ago, the degree of content overlap on the AZ500 exam was enormous, upwards to, like, I would estimate 45% or more between the AZ500 exam and the AZ104, the Azure Administrator Associate. And it used to be that the Azure Architecture exams were in twos. There was 303 and 304. Huge amount of overlap among those exams. And as more and more of these role-based certifications spring up, we're seeing a gradual refactoring, as I said. So now it looks like a lot of that stuff that used to be in here. I mean, we used to have to know about all the different ways to configure synchronized identity, pass-through authentication, and all of that. That's been stripped out of here, so we no longer need to worry about it. What's this one saying? You manage an Azure AD tenant for your company. You add two users to Azure AD as defined below. One is a local Active Directory user from on-prem who's synced with Azure AD Connect. Another is an Azure AD B2B user from another tenant from a partner company. What are the user types in your tenant? Again, this is too basic, in my opinion, for the live exam. The live exam does not work at too low of a level. In other words, the live exam's not going to be a test of fact recall. It's really going to work at a higher level of sophistication where you're going to need to make conclusions and perform analysis as opposed to just, recalling facts. I actually showed this in that little brief demo I did, didn't I? The fact that you've got guest and member classes. I guess the trick here, there is a little bit of a cleverness here. It might not be obvious. If you create a user directly in your tenant, if I go back to Azure AD, we could reasonably judge that those cloud users are going to show up as members because they're being authenticated right here in this tenant. But for accounts like this one here, the sync account that is being replicated from my local Active Directory, here's the answer actually. Notice that they come in as members as well. Then what's the difference between a member user type and a guest? Well, a guest is going to be coming in through the external identity flow, also called Azure AD business to business collaboration. Other than that, it's really just a governance issue, isn't it? We do have some greater control over how to handle guests. If we go to the root of our tenant and if we come down under, let me see if I can remember, external identities, where are you? Here you go. And in external identities, we have external collaboration settings, and that's where you can tweak how guests are, what level, kind of a initial level of privilege that they have. But ultimately, and I always like to stress this to customers, students, whomever, it doesn't matter whether you're a guest or a member. From a perspective of role-based access control, they're exactly the same, aren't they? So for instance, I can come into this INE resource group and I can assign roles just as easily to a guest as I can a member. They're indistinguishable. And I think that's just by design. All right, so it looks like A is going to be a member and B is an external user. So actually that's a little bit tricky too because it depends on where the user is coming from. In this case, it does say that the user is not coming from, say, Gmail or a totally separate identity provider. It's saying that the B2B user exists in another tenant. Now, it's a little vague. If the writer here was intending this to be Azure AD tenant, I wish they wrote that. Let's actually take a look at the answer. Okay, so the answer is going with guest. Interesting. Okay. I'm trying to find ones that are a bit terse or on the terser side, if that makes sense. You're developing a web application that needs to retrieve data from Azure SQL database. All right. Your static code security analysis identified a SQL connection string with a username and password in your code in plain text. Uh-oh. You need to eliminate this vulnerability in your app. Which two actions should you identify to achieve the goal, and each correct answer presents a complete solution? That's good, because that's what the live exam will do. The exam, when necessary, the exam will say that each correct answer either is an independent solution or each correct answer represents part of a single solution. So the strategy there is to make sure you're parsing every word in these questions. So I'll pause while you look at these choices. Let's see what the answer is. Create a user assigned managed identity or a system assigned managed identity. Why is it saying that? Oh boy, this is a big definition. Now, pro tip, you'll find that in general, measure up explanations. The first paragraph is the one that defines why the correct answer or answers are correct. And then there'll be a separate paragraph for each of the incorrect answer choices. All right. So if you don't have time or willingness to look at the, whoa, my pen just kind of went crazy, but if you don't have time or willingness to look them all, at least that first paragraph will give you the explanation as to why the correct choice is correct. What's this one doing? Well, this is a build list and reorder. What is it asking? You're an Azure Resource Tenant Administrator, whatever that is, in a Resource Account Azure AD multi-tenant architecture. Well, let's say tenant a couple more times. You need to provide users with accounts residing in the accounts Azure AD tenant access. This is falling apart quickly. Let me try this again. You need to provide users with accounts in the tenant access to your resources. Okay, all right. What actions should you perform in sequence? 3 actions. I'll pause again while you take a look here. Let me see if I can scroll down to reveal some of the question text without hiding one of the choices. Nope, it looks like I can't. I still am not really understanding that too much. Residing in the accounts. So I guess you have two Azure AD tenants is what this is saying. So this is quizzing us on guest access or external access, isn't it? That's what it sounds like. That's good. This question has its heart in the right place because this is an important subject because we've got quite a bit of control as Azure AD administrators on doing external access. Let's see what the correct answer is. Send the account's Azure AD users an invitation. Ensure that the account's Azure AD users accept the invitation, and then choose an Azure AD identity provider for authentication. I guess, let me just rephrase. Here's what I want to make sure you understand. I think the kernel of that question is to make sure we understand the basic flow of inviting external users into our tenant. Now, whether the user gets an email or not depends on how you've set it up. So what I would say, step 0, is not to come in here and immediately start inviting external users. We'll want to go back to external identities, and we'll want to set up our identity providers. And just by way of review, the default one is, of course, we've got Azure AD authentication. Excuse me, let me, Snagit is having a hard day, so let me exit that. And my drawing program, Epic Pen, wants to choose its own size, so let me fix that as well. Okay, yeah, so the native identity providers would be the tenant itself, and we've got Microsoft account. That was the original way to do external identity, and we can do a one-time passcode. Azure AD has built-in federation support for Google and Facebook, and I've set up Fed with Google. Now, that means that if I invite a guest user on their Gmail account, they're not going to get an email invitation. They can just try to sign into the cloud app that's protected with Azure AD directly. And as long as they're successfully authenticated to Google, because of that federation trust that this stands up between your tenant and Google, they will be let in as a guest user. Simple as that. Same thing with Facebook, and then you can roll your own Federation Trust using either SAML or WS Fed by going about it that way. But I think that's what the exam is going for. Now, certainly, if you don't configure additional identity providers, then the user will receive an email, and when they redeem their invitation, if they don't have a Microsoft account, they'll be forced to create one. Now, I think the reason why Microsoft has greatly expanded the external identities is because, especially nowadays with all these breaches and leaks, who wants an extra credential? And if you don't already have a Microsoft account or an MSA, maybe you want to bring in a temporary person, a developer or a consultant, and they don't want to have a Microsoft account. What are you going to do to accommodate them? You see what I mean? So that, I think, is the main kernel from a study perspective where that's going. What's this one doing? Your company has a web app named Corp Intranet that uses Azure AD authentication. You configure, okay, this is out of scope because we don't have the synchronization stuff on the exam outline anymore, so there's no point in messing with that. What about this one? No, I want to find something a bit more cogent. Let's see here. Nope. This might be useful. Let's take a look. Your company has an Azure subscription named Sub1 that's associated with an Azure AD tenant named company.com. You plan to configure Azure AD PIM to enforce least privilege administration for Azure AD and Azure resources. You need a colleague to enable PIM. Currently, she's a developer. She has developer roles assigned. What should you do first? This is a legit question for sure. Do we assign Pat Smith the global administrator role? Do we instruct her to work in PIM to discover subscription resources? Do we instruct her to consent to PIM? Or do we assign her owner? This is a really good question, actually. Wow. This brings in a lot of important stuff. At one point in time, I used to call AZ500 the Azure AD PIM exam because there's so much on it. I think that's less true nowadays, but still, there's no question you're going to need to be really sharp on using Azure AD PIM, including how to onboard the service. And the way that works in a nutshell is, let me go back to the portal. We go to the PIM area in the Azure portal. And the first global administrator who comes in here, if you go to the quick start, let's see, it's not really obvious where to get to the quick start. Let me come into Azure Resources and let me hit Discover, because I have, oh, I guess I did consent already. Well, anyway, in order to turn on the lights, so to speak, to initially get this service up and running, it's always in the portal, but you have to consent to PIM. You need to be a global administrator to do that. In other words, you have to have the highest role permission in Azure AD. When that global administrator consents to PIM, PIM will permanently tattoo your Azure AD such that when you start assigning roles in here, you're going to see the PIM stuff already in here. Stuff about active, expired, and eligible assignments. So consenting to PIM is a one-way operation. One thing you're not going to see is PIM tattoo the resource side. This speaks to, I think, the fact that Azure AD is aligned to the Microsoft Graph API, and Azure itself, the Azure resource side, is Azure Resource Manager API, different development teams, etc. I think that may be at play here. But anyway, yeah, so that consent process requires global admin. And the other thing that PIM will do, besides turn on the lights, so to speak, and tattoo your Azure AD tenant, it'll create another role for delegated administration of PIM. So let me go back to the roles list here and let me search. I forgot what it's called. It's privileged something or other. Yeah, here it is. And this is something that very ripe to show up on your exam. If the exam asks you, how could you delegate PIM administration to one of your colleagues? You don't need to give them, and probably should not give them, global administrator. You can use the privileged role administrator role. That's going to allow you to manage the role aspects of PIM, but you'll probably also want to give them security administrator as well, which is going to give them privilege to the various Azure AD security tools like conditional access and identity management and that kind of stuff. Make sense? So let's see what the answer is here. I see that we're rapidly dwindling on our time. This makes sense, yes. If he or she or they does not have the global administrator role yet, we're going to need to do that first before they're able to consent. We certainly don't want to do owner, and Pat's not going to be able to do resource discovery until they've turned on the lights of the service to begin with. So that's a really nice item for sure. All right, so in parting here, as we're getting towards the top of the hour, in that slide deck, like I said, I have those learning resources again, and if the deck isn't yet in the Teams files list, it will be by tomorrow. I'll make sure of it. So these are good starter resources. Let me give you another one, speaking of our O'Reilly subscription that's going to disappear pretty soon. I have a public GitHub repo that you can go to. If the short link actually is timw.info/az500. Whoops, where's my drawing tools here? timw.info/az500. I'm terrible. I'm left-handed and my mouse is in my right hand. That's my excuse for this terrible, abysmal writing. But this is a public repo that I like to teach from a lot, and you'll find some good goodies in there. In particular, look for this AZ500 Cert Study Blueprint. It's in the root of the directory, and it's a markdown file where I round up what I think are some of the highest impact study links. I give you theoretical knowledge, then I give you tips on hands-on skill development, places to go, building your tool set to support your cert study, assuming that you're going to use VS Code. A bit on Bicep. I put this here just to be forward thinking. To my understanding, I haven't seen Bicep in any of the Microsoft exams yet. I know it's coming. It'll eventually be there, but it's not yet. I have a link to the measure up, but we've already covered that. And then there's some exam specific information at the bottom of the file. Here, I want to call out in closing, we don't need to worry about discounts because we get exam registrations for free. If you have a problem in your exam delivery, it's critical that you know who to file your issue with. Remember that it's not Microsoft, but Pearson VUE that handles the delivery. So if you have an item with your proctor, if you're doing online testing, or if the exam engine crashes, or if something happens with the delivery mechanism, you want to go to this page and you can do an online chat. I don't know if it's a bot or a human being or some combination thereof, or you could do an email support. It would only be if you have a complaint issue with the exam content. Then actually I have a separate page for Pearson View Grievance right here. Then in that case, if it's the exam content that you're concerned with, you can go to the Microsoft Policies and FAQs page and you can file, it's not called a grievance. I think they call it an item challenge. So anyway, I hope that you found this session high impact. I know I teach and speak very quickly, but please understand that the recording, Claudia puts the MP4 recordings in the files list of this channel so that you can always come back and review, and you can even slow me down to get a more reasonable experience. Let me ask one more time. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay.